Welcome to the Weekly Takeaway, what you need to know from the news. And this has been a crazy news cycle, a news cycle that you cannot escape. You know what's happening in the world. Right now, we are coming off of a long period of news dealing specifically with coronavirus and all of the related issues. That's what we've been talking about. And now we're talking about something else. We're talking about protesting and rioting across the country, and so many different things that are attached to that. So many issues and so many concerns and so much conversation about right, wrong, and otherwise. Were the actions right? Has the response been right? What is the American right to respond to these things? So many questions, and much of this will be addressed really in the months, I would even imagine in the years ahead. So many things we have to deal with. And this week, as we come to our news stories, I want to talk about one news story or one aspect of this much larger story. As we tend to focus on military stories and stories of faith, there is a military component to what is happening across the country. And again, so many issues we could deal with. We're not going to discuss those right now, but I do want to talk about the military aspect of this. The military.com, which is a newspaper, an online newspaper that deals with military issues, had an interesting article this week in response to the president's announcement that force would be used, military force, he said, would be used to deal with the rioters across the country, and in particular in the District of Columbia. And then he did something that I don't think any president has ever done. He left the White House grounds and walked across the street to a church while there was an active protest going on. Very, very interesting story. If you haven't seen that, you can find that. But military.com talks about this, and again, all of this is on the heels of the events that happened on Memorial Day with George Floyd. He was killed by a police officer, so many other things happening. But here's the article. I want to read some of this and make some comments along the way, because this speaks specifically to our men and women in the military. Here's the first sentence. District of Columbia Mayor Muriel Bowser said Tuesday that local police took no part in what she called a shameful as in quotes, assault by the National Guard and federal law enforcement on protesters that cleared the way for President Donald Trump to have photos taken in front of a historic church. And again, if you're not familiar with this, President Trump went to the St. John's Episcopal Church, that is called the Church of the Presidents. This is where presidents historically have worshiped across the street from the White House. And as he was going there, and there was some photos taken and some media done, the protesters that were around there were pushed to the sides. And the comments that the mayor is making is in regards to how that was handled. She said it was shameful what the National Guard and federal law enforcement did. She went on, Trump wanted a show of force in D.C., Bowser said, referring to Guard and federal officers using tear gas, flashbangs, and rubber bullets against protesters across from the White House on Monday evening. Senior defense officials said Tuesday that Guard troops who took part in clearing the streets were not equipped with tear gas or other crowd control measures and did not use any in working with an interagency force. Response to the actions in the district, as well as Trump's warning that he might send active duty combat troops to quell riots, broke down along partisan lines in Congress. And I'll come back to this article here in just a moment. I think it's important for us to, first of all, distinguish between the active duty component of the United States military and the National Guard. This is something that has been misunderstood, and part of it is an optics issue. The National Guard, they are components of the United States military. They can be the Air National Guard serving alongside of or as a component of the Air Force, the Army National Guard, of course, serving as a component of the United States Army. But these are citizen soldiers. In fact, in many of the cities where the National Guard is now being used to help deal with the rioters, the folks who are in the National Guard called up to deal with these riots are coming from the cities that they're now defending. Historically, we've seen the National Guard used in a number of ways, often during natural disasters like storms and floods, or when dealing with a health disaster. Even through the coronavirus issues over the last couple of months, the National Guard has been used in various ways within the context of their own states. The National Guard serves at the discretion of the governor of each state, and so when they're used to deal with whatever's happening in their state, that's exactly why they were created. And that is a distinction between them, the National Guard, and our active duty service members. Our active duty service members are in place. They have been stood up and trained to deal with those who would seek to do harm to our country, whether from within or without. And again, we have lived through nearly 20 years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan. We know what this looks like. These are two distinct organizations. And so to conflate the two is just not a proper view of what's actually happening. So when governors and others would say we don't want the military in our city, they need to understand there's a difference between having the military in their city and having citizens from that region who are there to serve come and help deal with those who are destroying property and hurting others. I'll continue with this article. Possibly the most confrontational comments on the Democrat side came from Representative Seth Moulton, a Democrat from Massachusetts, a former Marine captain and veteran of 4 tours in Iraq. In a statement, Moulton said active duty troops should be prepared to risk court-martial by defying any orders to go into the states to put down protests. His quote is this: "If Trump chooses to abuse the military as a tyrant would do, to stifle dissent, suppress freedom, and cement inequality, then I call on our proud young men and women in uniform as a veteran and a patriot to lay down your arms, uphold your oath, and join this new march for freedom," Moulton said. This is his comment. This is his admonition to those who serve in the United States military. And again, understanding the context of this is very, very important. The right to peacefully protest is a right that is ensconced in our founding documents. This is a right that many in the military would say if they were sitting here, and I will say as someone who served in the military, that is a right that in part we went to the front lines of combat to defend. The right of Americans to redress their government, the right of Americans to peacefully protest. But the conversation around using the National Guard and even beyond that, the United States military to deal with rioters is not a question about using the military to, as Moulton said, stifle dissent, suppress freedom, and cement inequality. That's not why those in uniform are being sent to these hot spots around the country. We know in places around the country that many of these peaceful protests have been infiltrated by individuals who don't care about peaceful protest. In fact, they're there to do anything but peacefully protest. We've seen buildings burned, stores looted, individuals hurt, and some even murdered, and on and on and on we could go. And the call to bring in the National Guard and potentially down the road at some point to even use the United States military in these areas is a call to use the force that we have to protect American citizens from those that would seek to do them harm. Now, if you're listening to this, you can say there is some legal precedent that would get in the way and some things that have to be dealt with. I wouldn't argue with that at all. But we need to see things clearly. And if there's a takeaway right in the middle of the article, that's it. We need to look at this clearly. The job of the President of the United States really is very, very simple. Now, over the generations that we've had presidents of the United States, the job of the President has been twisted and turned and mixed up with other things, and we now look to the President to do all kinds of things that the President was never intended to do. But the President of the United States is to protect the rights of the citizens of the United States. That's why he's the Commander-in-Chief of the United States military. That's why it is his sworn duty, his sworn responsibility to protect the citizens that have elected him president. And so when we step back and we consider what's happening, when the president says it may be time for federal intervention into what's happening in many of these large cities, it is absolutely not okay. It is un-American to send federal law enforcement or the United States military to stop peaceful protests. That's a right. But it is the job of those in authority to protect citizens from damage done to their properties or their persons by others. This issue then, if we step back and really see it for what it is, becomes much more complicated than what we're being told on the news. And again, I bring this up week after week. We must work to get beneath the headlines and understand what's actually happening. That's why we started this time each week. It was so that we could help provide some perspective on what's happening in the world, because we're fed so much information and so much news is coming to us all of the time, particularly around these issues. I'll continue reading. Senator Tim Scott, a black South Carolina Republican, said violence stemming from the protests dishonors the memory of Floyd. He said this: the importance of having order in our communities is an absolutely essential component of us being able to have justice for Mr. Floyd. At a news conference with D.C. Police Chief Peter Newsham, Bowser, that's the mayor of Washington, D.C., noted that she has little influence on Trump under the district's limited home rule. But she urged the president to reconsider his threat to send active duty combat troops into the states and the district to restore order unless local authorities take action. Here's what she said: I heard what you all heard about the president saying he wanted all manner of civilian and military might to quell civil unrest. We all heard that ominous warning. And again, I think stepping back, we can understand why the president issued that warning. Because the city of Washington, D.C., again, buildings burned, the church that he visited burned. Many of our nation's memorials and monuments were not only burned, but damaged in many other ways, including the Vietnam Veteran Memorial, the Lincoln Memorial, and others. And the president, again, this is not a defense of the president, but understanding the entirety of the situation. This is him looking at what's happening in his city and saying something needs to stop, and I'll do what I can to stop it. Now, again, we can argue about the legality of that decision, and that's a real question to be answered, a real argument to be had. Can that legally take place? But to use the National Guard, citizen soldiers that come from that region to defend property is entirely appropriate. The article continues: in a Twitter post Tuesday morning, Trump defended the actions to clear the streets. D.C. had no problems last night. Many arrests, great job done by all, overwhelming force. The interagency force that cleared the streets near Lafayette Square on Monday evening included the National Guard, mounted U.S. Park Police, the FBI, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the U.S. Marshal Service, and the Bureau of Prisons, according to the Justice Department. A lot of folks involved in this action. I could go on and read, but I think you get the point. And again, there is so much to this story. All the way back, it seems like a long time ago. It wasn't that long ago, but just over a week ago, to the death of George Floyd. And man, as I look at the story and I consider the story, and I'm sure you do too, seeing almost unanimous opposition to the actions of the police department, and many folks standing up across the country, folks who have never protested anything, saying that's wrong, and it is, and it was. But that then becoming a completely different conversation when not just peaceful protests, but rioting and looting took place. Things we'll consider and think about and talk about for many, many years. But as it relates to the United States military, and this is the point of my conversation here today, there are a number of questions at work. And I believe that there will be a lot to be learned and discussed after the fact when we get to the other side of this, to understand how force was used, how the military was employed, and whether or not it was right or wrong, and if it was effective. But we need to be very, very careful to understand the entirety of a situation before forming an opinion about the rightness or wrongness of the actions taken by those who have been put in place to protect not only the property of citizens, but the lives and livelihoods of those same citizens. And in all of this, we're reminded again, even this week, that whether at home or abroad, we have wonderful young men and women who have volunteered, and I'm thankful for our volunteer service, to stand up and defend those who cannot defend themselves. Let's pray for them, and let's pray for peace across our country. I hope you have a great weekend, and we look forward to what the next several days bring us and a new perspective next week.